Hello internet, and today's video is going to be another question and queries, those videos in which I ask you a question and we just kind of figure it out. So last video on this I did a topic on mermaids, about different mermaid species and how I saw that. So go watch that first so that you can get a better context for this video, because that is a conversation that will be brought back up again in the course of this video. Well, most of this video is going to be talking about how I think mermaid reproduction works. It is going to have a bunch of different things because it's going to be super rambly, and it's probably better you get the whole conversation than just this part so you know where I'm coming from. So forgive me if I seem really rambly. I hope everything makes sense. Now, a comment that I got last video was something about mermaids being mammals, and I have thought about that, so I'm going to address that first. I do not think mermaids are mammals, simply because if mermaids were mammals, then they wouldn't be able to live under the sea. And that is just something I can't comprehend, because most of the time we think of mermaids as living deep under the sea, completely separate from humans. Now, if mermaids were mammals, they would have to live closer to their surface, so their civilizations would only be like a semi-submerge or something like that, or would be very shallow waters or very close to somewhere where they could come above water, because mammals cannot breathe in the water and transfer water into breathable air. They have to come back up. Dolphins are mammals. They cannot breathe underwater. They have to come back up for air. So I don't think mermaids are mammals. I think they have gills. So mermaids are not mammals. Even though they are humanoid, I simply would not categorize all mermaids as mammals. However, I do think certain mermaids and certain mermaid species could be more mammal. Like if, say, they had dolphin tails, then I would say, yeah, that mermaid's more likely to be a mammal. But like mermaid species in general, I think most mermaid species would have gills and therefore would not be mammals at all. So, first, clearing up there a little bit of thoughts on that. Now for mermaid reproduction. Before I get started, I'm just going to do a disclaimer. I'm not a marine biologist. I know absolutely nothing about fish. Like, any knowledge that I'm going to spew upon you is amateur research that I've done and just random ramblings that I've thought about. So don't try to come at me for being like, you don't know how fish work, because I'm sorry, but I didn't look up fish porn before I decided to do this video. I didn't really want that on my search history, and didn't really want to look up how like fish have sex. Like, wasn't something I was interested in. However, I did look up different ways that fish could give birth, and there are two major ways that I found that fish could give birth. So fish can either give birth to live young, which is what humans do. You get a fully formed organism out of it, no eggs involved, or fish can give birth to eggs. So they lay eggs in like a little clutch somewhere dark to try to keep them safe. They either have these eggs pre-fertilized before they lay them, or they lay unfertilized eggs that are later crop dusted by the male fish and then fertilized. So if we are supposed to go off this premise that mermaids can potentially be different species depending on what fish they best emulate with, it would be logical then to assume that mermaids could either give birth to live young or eggs in some sort of capacity, depending on which fish that they both parallel to. So some mermaid species might give birth to live young, and some mermaid species might lay eggs that are later fertilized. However, I think we could also make the argument that since all mermaids are humanoid, it would be more likely that they all give birth to live young, since humans don't lay eggs. So that could be a more dominant trait in mermaids, that they all give birth to live young. As to how two mer people come together and produce a mer person, I would assume that all mer people have sexual organs that somehow mimic a fish's sexual organs and are not humanesque in any sort of fashion. Since the pictures and depictions we usually see of mermaids is like below the belly, they are all fish, and all their reproductive organs would be located there. I think it would be more logical to assume that they have fishy reproductive organs. So they would be all fish down there. And like I said, I didn't look up fish porn to see what those organs look like or how that functions, but I would assume between two mer people that would happen in the very same fashion in which fishes are born. So there's that. However, it is a very curious question to figure out how like cross-species interrelationships would work, especially if we are separating some species of mermaids being able to give birth to live young, while others may prefer to do an eggs. So that would be really interesting if we did cross-species, especially if we did cross-species and we're looking at different species of mermaids. I am wondering whether or not the hybrid of these two different species would be sterile, because I think of mermaids and this idea of different species of mermaids probably being along the same lines as big cats, where they're all in the same family group, but there are small DNA differences between them, so that even though that they can reproduce together, their offspring would be a hybrid but a sterile one. So like ligers are sterile. Mules, horses and donkeys, those are sterile as well. And this has to do with like a lack of chromosomes, that just they don't have enough chromosomes for them to be non-sterile. I think it'd be really interesting if like we threw in magic there, and then these cross-species relationships could like possibly give birth to a non-sterile child, or we could have like awesome mer people scientists who have figured out like DNA stuff that would make this like union work so that their children are not sterile. It would be a really interesting concept. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that in terms of like mer people reproduction, how this idea of like different species of mermaids would work, since like traditionally, even when like a species is within the same familial group, depending on the different subcategories of species in between those species usually cannot cross and produce a non-sterile hybrid. So like that would depend on like throwing magic and stuff like that, but general premise, I think mermaid people, like mer people, would have sexual reproductive organs that would mimic fish's reproductive organs, just based on location. And then depending on whether or not you want to argue all mermaids give birth to live young because they all are humanoid, or you want to go down this weird path of there being different species of mermaids that correlate to different fishes, and therefore mermaids can either be born by live young or by crop dust and some unfertilized eggs. And that is a weird image to have in your head. As for like hybrids between mer people and humans, I just throw in magic there. I don't even try to figure out how like fish reproductive organs would work with human reproductive organs. I've always been of like the assumption that mermaids have that magic where they can just go to a complete different species, like transform into a human, which is really weird because they just go from being one species to another species. Like that's really weird, but beside the point. So if like mer people have this ability that they can somehow become humans, I would assume that like then we could do and create a baby. I would argue that their baby may more likely turn out to be a mer person. We could simply argue that the mer gene is more dominant than the human gene. So even though these two are humans while doing the and having this baby conceived, it would be more likely the baby be a mer person because mer genes are more dominant than human ones. So like that's a different conversation. So when we go mer people, fish organs, so works like fish reproduction. When we go human mermaids, those mermaids become humans, and then mermaids have the dominant gene, so their child is more likely to be a mer person. I would be curious to see what it would look like with these different species of mermaids based on reproduction, especially when it comes to like certain species of fish which have different weird abilities that I find really interesting. Like say seahorses have this ability that the males give birth, so it would be really interesting to see a mer species that is like seahorse-ish, and then the males are the ones giving birth, and like how that would work for everything. And then imagine that like being cross-special in mermaids. Like that would be like really cool and interesting. And talking on that same subject, I used to like read a lot of shifter erotica sort of stuff. Like it's a smutty genre, right, where it's like the supernaturals and like, oh, like he's a werewolf or whatever, and like he's getting together with so and so. So there was this one weird series where there was like a shifter shark, so it was a were shift book about were people and like shifters, and one was a were shark, so he became a shark when he shifted, and one was a were seahorse, and this was a male romance, and the seahorse ended up getting pregnant because he was a seahorse shifter, and male seahorses are the ones that get pregnant. So like it's a very interesting thing to think about, and like I can't even like, I just randomly remembered that book. That was a really weird book. Like the internet's full of weird things if you could only look for them. So like go check that out if you want some weird smutty male romance sort of things. But like just that whole concept of having like a subspecies of mermaids that is based on like seahorses, where the reproductive like properties are more carried in the males, where they are the ones that get pregnant and give birth. That'd be really interesting. We could look at like say clownfish mermaids, and like clownfish, if you're not aware, have this like weird ability that's super cool, that if a clownfish population no longer has like females in it, male clownfish have this very rare ability where they can change their sexual organs to be female. So this ensures the survival of the species. So they can transition into female. That would be a really awesome mer species to see, and then just how those reproductive organs work, because you transition from male to female naturally by your body's necessity for that thing. Then there are like, I guess starfish are like asexual, if I'm not mistaken. They like regrow out of parts, like you cut off the arm of a starfish and the rest of the starfish grows out of that. So maybe like certain mer people would be asexual and they could just give birth or like multiply based on like cutting off limbs or stuff. So I think for mer reproduction, I truly believe it depends on the species of mermaid, right? It like in my mind, it depends on the species of mermaid, like what type of fish you're using to base your mermaids from, what correlation these mermaids have to a certain species of fish, and then their reproductive organs and like philosophies and stuff would follow along similar to that fish. However, if you don't want to get into that complexity, you could just say all mer people, by being humanoid in nature, all give birth to live young, and therefore that's how mermaids happen. However, I would still say mermaid reproductive organs, no matter how these mer people are birthed, would emulate a more fish reproductive organs than humans, simply because that's where their reproductive organs are located. So I don't know how a human and mermaid relationship would work if that mermaid does not have that magical ability to become human, because I haven't looked into how fish reproductive organs work and I'm not really interested in it. Might be possible, and if I were interested in looking at like fish sex, I might have an answer for you, but I don't, because I really don't want to look that up. So you can, that's just a thought, take it as you will. Those are all my ramblings on how I think perhaps mermaids could be birthed. I think it's really interesting to figure out whether or not you want to have mermaids that have live young or mermaids that have eggs, whether or not you want to go to species of mermaids and like cross species, whether or not you want to take certain traits from certain fish, like say clownfish or seahorses, which change the whole game of how reproduction is going to work for that mer species. But I think this would be an interesting thing for somebody to like write a book about, and I would eat it up, because I think mermaids have a lot of potential for how interesting they can be, and people are not taking in how interesting mermaids are. Like, mermaids are multifaceted creatures, and I think we should write about them as such and treat them as such, because it'd be really, really cool. Really cool. Like imagine like different mermaid species depending on like their fish sides, but then different races of mermaids depending on like their human sides, or maybe like mermaids in general just like look more fishy, so they'd be like more like tinted blue and stuff, and like they'd have like awesome gills and like fish eyes, and it could be so cool. It could be so cool. Where are these books? So these are all my ramblings, as I have stated before. I hope they made some semblance of sense, that you could figure out what I was talking about and going for. So if you like what you're seeing here and you want to continue to see more, click all those bunnies down below, and goodbye, internet.